sea air smelled of salt and decay, a combination that clung to Ellie Hart's skin like an unwelcome shadow. She had driven for hours along winding coastal roads to reach Blackwater Cove, her car tires crunching over loose gravel as she pulled into the town square. The place looked like it belonged in a postcard from another century. Weathered stone cottages leaning precariously against each other, their chimneys exhaling thin plumes of smoke into the damp evening sky. A single lamppost flickered weakly at the center of the square, casting long, skeletal shadows across cobblestones slick with rain. But there was something wrong here, something Ellie couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't just the eerie stillness or the way the townsfolk avoided eye contact as they shuffled past her car. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight pressing down on her chest that made every breath feel shallow and uncertain. She stepped out of the car, her boots splashing through puddles as she reached for her bag in the trunk. The sound startled her, a sharp clink of metal against metal, and she froze, glancing around. No one was watching, or at least no one seemed to be, but she could feel eyes on her, invisible but unmistakable, boring into her back like needles. "Get a grip," she muttered under her breath, slamming the trunk shut. This was ridiculous. She was Eleanor Hart, investigative journalist extraordinaire, or so she liked to tell herself when she wasn't drowning in student loan debt and rejection emails. She'd come to Blackwater Cove chasing a story about strange disappearances linked to some freak weather phenomenon. That was all this was, just another assignment, another chance to prove herself. Ellie checked into the only inn in town, a creaky old building called the Salty Anchor. The sign above the door swung lazily in the breeze, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of mildew and stale beer. Behind the counter stood a wiry man with sunken cheeks and watery blue eyes. His name tag read Mr. Hargrove, though Ellie doubted anyone ever called him by his first name. "You're not from around here," he said flatly, sliding a key across the counter without looking up. It was more of a statement than a question. "Nope." Ellie forced a smile, slipping her credit card onto the desk. "Just passing through." Hargrove finally raised his head, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "You'll want to stay indoors after dark, miss, especially near the water." "Why's that?" Ellie asked casually, though a chill ran down her spine. She'd read enough local legends online to know what he meant, the fog. But hearing it spoken aloud sent a different kind of shiver through her. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if afraid the walls might overhear. "It ain't natural. What happens out there? People go missing, boats don't come back, and those who do..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Best not to ask questions. Ellie nodded politely, pocketing the key. "Thanks for the tip." As she climbed the narrow staircase to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that Hargrove hadn't been entirely forthcoming. There was something else he wanted to say, something too terrible to put into words. Whatever it was, it lingered in the air behind her like the sour tang of seaweed rotting in the sun. Her room was small and sparsely furnished, with faded floral wallpaper and a window that rattled whenever the wind picked up. Ellie set her laptop on the rickety desk and plugged in her phone charger. Outside, the horizon was swallowed by twilight, the ocean blending seamlessly with the darkening sky. She cracked open the window to let in some fresh air, but instead of relief, she was met with an oppressive silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of countryside living. It was the kind of silence that felt deliberate, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then came the fog. It rolled in without warning, creeping up the cliffs like a living thing. One moment, the stars were visible. The next, they were smothered beneath a thick blanket of gray. Ellie watched it approach, mesmerized and uneasy. The air grew colder, biting at her fingertips where they rested on the windowsill. And then she heard it. Whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks on her ears, but the whispers grew louder, clearer, until they formed actual words. Fragments of sentences drifted toward her, disjointed and nonsensical. Come closer. Don't look back. She knows. Ellie slammed the window shut, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight app, shining it out into the darkness. The beam illuminated nothing but swirling mist, dense and impenetrable. For a split second, she thought she saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees, but when she blinked, it was gone. "This is insane," she whispered, backing away from the window. Her rational mind screamed at her to dismiss it as nerves, fatigue, anything logical. But deep down, she knew better. Something was out there, something ancient and hungry. To distract herself, Ellie flipped on the radio beside her bed. Static crackled to life, filling the room with white noise. She twisted the dial, searching for a station, but all she found were fragments of voices speaking languages she didn't recognize. Then, suddenly, clarity. Eleanor. Her name, spoken softly, almost tenderly, cutting through the static like a knife. She dropped the radio, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound died instantly, leaving her in deafening silence. Her pulse roared in her ears as she stared at the device, willing it to make any noise at all. Even static would have been preferable. But it remained dead, its screen blank. For the rest of the night, Ellie sat huddled on the edge of her bed, clutching a flashlight like a talisman. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sent her jumping. Sleep eluded her completely, and when dawn finally broke, painting the horizon in streaks of pale pink and gold, she told herself it had all been a trick of exhaustion. But as she packed her things and prepared to explore the town further, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her reflection stared back, wide-eyed and pale, but for a fleeting moment, she swore she saw someone standing behind her in the room. When she spun around, there was no one there, and yet, the feeling of being watched never left her. The morning sun did little to dispel the unease that had settled over Blackwater Cove. Ellie woke groggy and disoriented, her body stiff from a night spent perched on the edge of the bed like a hunted animal. She splashed cold water on her face in the tiny bathroom, avoiding her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. Something about it felt off, as if the glass held more than just her image. Breakfast was served in a dimly lit dining hall adjacent to the inn's lobby. The room smelled faintly of burnt toast and boiled eggs, though no one seemed particularly hungry. A few locals sat scattered around wooden tables, their faces pale and drawn, eyes darting nervously toward the windows as if expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. Ellie approached the counter where an elderly woman ladled porridge into chipped bowls. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You're new here," the woman said without looking up. It wasn't a question. "Just passing through," Ellie replied, forcing a smile. "I'm writing a piece on local legends. Thought I'd see what makes this place tick." The woman paused, her spoon hovering midair. For a moment, Ellie thought she might ignore the comment entirely. Then she leaned closer, lowering her voice so only Ellie could hear. "If you're smart, you'll leave before sundown," she hissed. "This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders poking around its secrets." Before Ellie could respond, the woman turned away, busying herself with the kettle. Ellie stared after her, unsettled, but intrigued. Secrets, huh? That was exactly what she'd come for. After breakfast, Ellie wandered through the narrow streets of Blackwater Cove, notebook in hand. The townsfolk avoided her gaze, retreating into doorways or ducking behind curtains whenever she passed. It wasn't until she reached the harbor that she finally encountered someone willing to talk. Maggie O'Connor stood ankle-deep in the icy surf, dragging a net onto the rocky shore. She looked younger than Ellie expected, mid-20s maybe, with freckled cheeks and windswept red hair tied back in a messy braid. Her hands were calloused from years of hard labor, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made Ellie hesitate before approaching. "Hey," Ellie called out, stepping carefully over jagged rocks. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Maggie glanced up, startled, then relaxed slightly when she realized Ellie wasn't a local. "You're the journalist staying at the inn, right? What do you want to know?" "I'm looking into some of the strange things happening around here," Ellie said cautiously. "People keep mentioning the fog. Care to tell me about it?" Maggie froze, her grip tightening on the rope in her hands. For a moment, Ellie thought she wouldn't answer. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "It's not just fog," Maggie said quietly. "It's alive, or possessed, maybe. Takes people who wander too close to the cliffs after dark. My brother, he disappeared 3 years ago, vanished right off his boat. They found it drifting a week later, empty except for..." She trailed off, swallowing hard. "Except for what?" Ellie pressed gently. "Blood," Maggie whispered, "all over the deck, like he'd been torn apart." A chill ran down Ellie's spine, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Did they ever find him?" Maggie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, but sometimes, late at night, I hear him calling my name. From the woods, from the water, everywhere." She laughed bitterly, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "People think I'm crazy. Maybe I am. But I know what I hear." Ellie scribbled furiously in her notebook, though her hand shook slightly. "And these disappearances, they happen often?" "More than anyone wants to admit," Maggie said. "They try to cover it up, say it's accidents or storms, but we all know the truth. The fog takes them, and if you're lucky, you never see them again." Determined to dig deeper, Ellie decided to visit St. Agnes Church, the oldest building in town. Its steeple loomed over the surrounding cottages, crooked and weather-beaten, casting long shadows across the cobblestone path leading to its heavy oak doors. Inside, the air was musty and cold, carrying the faint scent of incense and damp stone. Sunlight filtered weakly through stained glass windows, depicting scenes of martyrdom and divine wrath. Ellie wandered down the aisle, her footsteps echoing eerily in the cavernous space. At the front of the church, a man knelt in prayer, his head bowed low. Father Thomas Calloway, according to the plaque beside the pulpit. He looked older than Ellie imagined, his thinning white hair and gaunt frame giving him the appearance of someone who hadn't slept in weeks. "Can I help you?" he asked, without turning around, his voice gravelly and weary. "I'm researching the history of the town," Ellie explained, stepping closer. "I heard this church played a role in some unpleasant events." Father Calloway rose slowly, his joints creaking audibly. His watery blue eyes studied her intently, as if weighing whether she could be trusted. Finally, he nodded toward a small alcove filled with dusty books and yellowed documents. "There are records of the witch trials," he said grimly, "if that's what you're looking for." Ellie followed him to the alcove, flipping open a leather-bound ledger. The pages were brittle and faded, but the entries were clear enough. Names, dates, accusations of witchcraft. Many ended with the same chilling phrase: "Executed by order of the church." "These women, they were innocent," Father Calloway murmured, his voice trembling with guilt. "We gagged them before execution, fearing their curses would bring ruin upon us." Perhaps they were right. Ellie frowned, glancing up from the book. "What do you mean?" The priest hesitated, clutching the rosary hanging from his belt. "The fog. It began shortly after the last trial. Some say the spirits of the condemned still linger, seeking vengeance. Others believe it's something older, darker. Whatever it is, it punishes sinners, and none of us are without sin. As Ellie left the church, the whispers returned. Faint at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves, but growing louder with each step she took. By the time she reached her car, they were deafening, overlapping voices chanting in unison. "Leave while you can. Don't look back. She knows." Panic surged through her veins as she fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice before finally unlocking the door. She dove inside, slamming it shut and locking it behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stared out the window, half expecting to see shadowy figures emerging from the mist. But the street remained empty. For now. The next morning brought a deceptive calm. The fog had receded, leaving behind a crystalline frost that clung to every surface in Blackwater Cove. Ellie woke to sunlight streaming through her window, casting long shadows across the warped wooden floorboards of her room. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a figment of her imagination, a trick of exhaustion and superstition. But then, she noticed it. On the windowsill, etched into the condensation left by the overnight chill, were 3 words, written in jagged, uneven letters. "She knows you." Her stomach churned as she wiped the message away with trembling fingers. It wasn't possible. She'd locked the door. No one could have gotten in or out without her noticing. Yet there it was, undeniable proof that something unnatural was at play. Determined to distract herself, Ellie headed to the harbor, hoping to speak with some of the fishermen who might know more about recent disappearances. Maggie had mentioned finding her brother's boat abandoned, but Ellie needed specifics, details that could anchor her investigation in reality rather than superstition. When she arrived, however, the mood was somber. A small crowd had gathered near the docks, their faces grim and hushed. At the center of the commotion lay a fishing vessel. Its hull scraped raw against the rocky shore. Blood smeared the deck like paint, glistening darkly in the pale light. "What happened here?" Ellie asked, approaching cautiously. One of the men turned to her, his face pale and drawn. "Tommy Walsh, he went out last night, said he'd be back before dawn, found his boat this morning." "Where's Tommy now?" Ellie pressed, though she already suspected the answer. The man shook his head, crossing himself instinctively. "Gone, just like the others." Ellie stepped closer, ignoring the protests of the townsfolk as she climbed aboard the wreckage. The stench hit her first, a metallic tang mixed with something sharper, almost chemical. Then she saw it, shards of glass embedded in the bloodstains, glinting like tiny teeth. And beneath them, scraps of fabric torn from what looked like a coat or jacket. She knelt down, brushing aside a shard with her pen. Beneath it lay a fragment of paper, crumpled and stained but still legible. Unfolding it carefully, she read the scrawled handwriting. "It's not safe here. They're watching. Don't trust anyone, not even yourself." Her pulse quickened as she pocketed the note. Whoever had written it knew something, or someone was targeting the townspeople. But who? And why? Later that afternoon, Ellie decided to pay a visit to Dr. Samuel Graves, the town physician. According to Maggie, he'd examined several of the returned victims before they vanished again, claiming to search for answers. If anyone knew what was really happening, it would be him. Graves's clinic was tucked away on the outskirts of town, a modest brick building surrounded by overgrown ivy. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old books. The reception area was empty save for a young nurse flipping idly through a magazine. When Ellie introduced herself, the woman directed her to an office at the end of the hall. Dr. Graves greeted her with a weary smile, his glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. His salt and pepper hair was disheveled, and dark circles ringed his eyes as if he hadn't slept in days. "You're the journalist," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I've heard about your inquiries." "I'm just trying to understand what's going on here," Ellie replied. "People keep disappearing, and no one seems willing to talk about it." Graves sighed, leaning back in his chair. That's because we don't fully understand it ourselves. What I can tell you is this. Those who return after being taken, they're never the same. How so? Ellie asked, leaning forward. They come back catatonic, barely responsive. But there's one thing they all do eventually. He paused, his expression grave. They sing. Sing, Ellie echoed, incredulous. What kind of singing? It's not music you'd recognize, Graves said softly. More like hymns, chants, words in languages none of us have ever heard. And when they start, it's only a matter of time before they disappear again. For good. Ellie scribbled furiously in her notebook, her mind racing. Do you think it's psychological? Some kind of trauma-induced psychosis? Graves hesitated, choosing his words carefully. At first, yes, that's what I thought. But then I started noticing physical changes. Their voices, they sound wrong, like static layered over speech, and their mouths. He trailed off, rubbing his temples. Look, Miss Hart, I'll level with you. There's something unnatural at work here, something beyond science. Whatever it is, it's feeding on fear, on guilt, on secrets. As Ellie left the clinic, the whispers returned. This time they weren't confined to her ears, they seeped into the very fabric of the world around her. Car radios crackled to life as she passed, spitting out fragments of sentences that made no sense. You shouldn't have come. Your sins will find you. Even the wind seemed to carry voices now, rising and falling in eerie harmony. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely insert the key into the ignition. And then she saw it. In her rearview mirror, reflected in the fading daylight, stood a figure cloaked in gray mist. Its face was obscured, but its glowing white eyes pierced through the haze, locking onto hers with predatory intensity. Before she could react, it raised a finger to its lips, a silent command to remain quiet. Ellie slammed her foot on the gas pedal, tires squealing as she sped away from the clinic. She didn't stop until she reached the safety of her room at the Salty Anchor, bolting the door behind her and collapsing onto the bed. For hours, she stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in her mind. The blood-stained boat, the cryptic note, the doctor's haunted warnings, and finally the figure in the mirror. Who or what was watching her, and how did it know her deepest fears? The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Ellie's notebook was filling up with fragmented details, bloodstains on boats, cryptic notes, glowing eyes in mirrors, but none of it added up to anything coherent. She felt like she was chasing shadows, grasping at threads that unraveled the moment she touched them. The fog had retreated since Tommy Walsh's disappearance, but its absence only made Blackwater Cove feel more suffocating. Every creak of floorboards, every rustle of leaves seemed to carry a hidden threat. And then there were the voices. They followed her everywhere now, whispering in languages she didn't understand, murmuring accusations she couldn't quite make out. Sometimes they sounded distant, like echoes carried on the wind. Other times, they were close enough to brush against her skin, cold and electric. At night, they became unbearable, a symphony of overlapping tones that clawed their way into her dreams, leaving her gasping awake in a cold sweat. She tried to tell herself it was stress, exhaustion, or some psychological trick of the mind, but deep down, she knew better. Whatever was happening here wasn't natural, and it wasn't random. It wanted something from her. Maggie O'Connor found her late one evening as Ellie sat alone in the harbor, staring out at the darkening horizon. The red-haired fisherman approached cautiously, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. "You look like hell," Maggie said bluntly, sitting beside her. "Thanks," Ellie muttered, forcing a weak smile. "I feel like it." Maggie studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You shouldn't be out here after sunset, not even close to the water." "I'm fine," Ellie insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. "Nothing's happened." "Not yet," Maggie replied grimly, "but it will. You've been asking too many questions, poking around places you shouldn't. The fog doesn't like that." Ellie turned to face her, frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "Then why are you still here? Why hasn't anyone left this godforsaken town? Maggie hesitated, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. Because we don't have a choice. Some of us were tied to this place, bound by things we can't escape. My brother, he's still out there somewhere. I hear him calling me every night. If I leave, I'll lose him forever. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Ellie felt a pang of guilt for pressing her. Maggie wasn't just scared. She was broken, clinging to the hope that her brother might return. Ellie recognized that desperation. It mirrored her own relentless pursuit of answers, no matter how dangerous they proved to be. "Tell me about the singing," Ellie said, gently changing the subject. "Dr. Graves mentioned it. What does it sound like?" Maggie shuddered visibly, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "It's not music. Not really. It's wrong, like nails scraping against glass, but softer and sadder. When you hear it, you want to follow it, to join in, and once you do..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "You don't come back." That night, unable to sleep, Ellie decided to investigate the abandoned lighthouse Maggie had mentioned during their first meeting. According to local legend, it had been shut down over a century ago after a keeper vanished under mysterious circumstances. Now it stood crumbling on the edge of the cliffs, its beacon long extinguished. Armed with a flashlight and her trusty notebook, Ellie drove to the outskirts of town, parking near the base of the rocky path leading to the structure. The air grew colder as she climbed, biting at her exposed skin. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the landscape. Shadows danced across the ground, shifting unnaturally as if alive. When she reached the lighthouse, she paused, taking in its decrepit grandeur. The stone walls were cracked and covered in ivy, while the metal railing circling the top platform sagged precariously. A heavy iron door barred entry, rusted nearly shut. Ellie tugged at it with all her strength, cursing under her breath until it finally groaned open. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and salt water. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing graffiti scrawled across the walls in faded ink and chalk. Symbols she didn't recognize, circles intersected by jagged lines, strange sigils that seemed to pulse faintly in the light. She snapped photos quickly, noting the dates etched beside some of the markings. They spanned decades, perhaps even centuries. As she ventured deeper into the building, the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath came out in visible puffs, fogging the lens of her camera. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They swirled around her like a storm, pulling at her clothes, brushing against her ears. "Turn back. Don't look. She knows." Ellie pressed forward, despite the growing dread coiling in her stomach. At the center of the room stood an altar-like table, its surface carved with intricate designs. On it rested a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and yellowed. She opened it carefully, scanning the spidery handwriting within. The entries described rituals performed by the lighthouse keepers, sacrifices meant to appease the watchers who dwelled in the mist. One passage caught her eye. "They demand silence. Those who speak their truths are taken, their voices stolen to feed the choir. Only those who repent may find peace, but even then, the debt must be paid." A sudden noise behind her made her whirl around, heart hammering. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the room. For a split second, she thought she saw movement, a shadow detaching itself from the wall, gliding toward her. Then everything went black. Awakening, Ellie woke to the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Her head throbbed painfully, and her flashlight lay shattered on the floor beside her. Panic surged through her veins as she scrambled to her feet, clutching the journal tightly to her chest. The whispers had stopped, but in their place was something worse. Complete silence. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of the ocean. Just the oppressive void of soundlessness pressing down on her like a physical weight. She stumbled toward the exit, tripping over debris in her haste. As she reached the doorway, she froze. Standing outside, silhouetted against the moonlight, were figures cloaked in mist. Their faces were obscured, but their glowing white eyes locked onto hers with unblinking intensity. One of them raised a hand, pointing directly at her. Before she could react, a scream tore through the silence. Not from her, but from somewhere deep within the woods. It was high-pitched and guttural, filled with unimaginable terror. Then another joined it, and another, until the night was alive with cries that chilled her to the bone. Ellie bolted, running blindly down the rocky path as fast as her legs would carry her. Behind her, the figures began to move, gliding effortlessly across the terrain. She didn't dare look back, didn't stop until she collapsed inside her car, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. For several minutes, she sat there, trembling uncontrollably, staring out the windshield at the empty road ahead. When she finally glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw it. A single strand of black thread dangling from the corner of her mouth. Ellie's hands trembled as she stared at the black thread dangling from the corner of her mouth. She reached up instinctively, fingers brushing against it. But the moment she touched it, a sharp pain shot through her jaw. It felt like pulling on a nerve, electric and raw. She yanked her hand away, gasping, and leaned closer to the rearview mirror. The thread wasn't just hanging there. It was embedded in her skin, stitching her lips together like sutures. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale, but something about it felt wrong. Her eyes seemed duller than usual, her expression almost blank, as if someone, or something else, was looking out through her face. "No," she whispered hoarsely, though the sound barely escaped her throat. "This isn't real." But it was. She could feel the thread tightening ever so slightly, tugging at her flesh with each panicked breath. The silence outside her car pressed in on her, suffocating and absolute. Even the wind had stopped moving, leaving the world eerily still. By the time Ellie returned to the salty anchor, dawn was breaking over Blackwater Cove, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. The town looked peaceful under the morning light, its secrets momentarily hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. But Ellie knew better. Every shadow seemed darker, every whisper louder, now that the fog had marked her. She found Maggie sitting alone in the inn's dining hall, nursing a cup of coffee. The fisherman glanced up as Ellie entered, her expression softening when she saw the panic etched into Ellie's face. "What happened?" Maggie asked, rising to her feet. Ellie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled the journal from her bag and slammed it onto the table, flipping it open to the ritualistic passages she'd read in the lighthouse. Her voice shook as she recounted everything. The symbols carved into the walls, the eerie silence, the figures cloaked in mist. "They're binding you," Maggie said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The thread, it's how they claim you." "Claim me for what?" Ellie demanded, her frustration boiling over. "What do they want?" Maggie hesitated, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "It's not just about taking people anymore. They need sacrifices, repentance, confession. That's why the victims sing. They're forced to reveal their sins before they vanish, and once they've confessed..." She trailed off, swallowing hard. "They join the choir." Ellie's stomach churned. "So I'm supposed to confess? To what? I haven't done anything." "It doesn't matter," Maggie replied bitterly. "The fog feeds on guilt, real or imagined. It twists your regrets, your fears, until you believe you deserve punishment. That's how it traps you." Ellie clenched her fists, fighting back tears of rage and despair. "There has to be a way to stop this, to break the cycle." Maggie shook her head sadly. "No one who goes near the fog comes back unchanged. You've already been marked. If you stay here, it's only a matter of time before you're gone too." Desperate for answers, Ellie sought out Father Thomas Calloway later that afternoon. The church was empty when she arrived, its stained glass windows casting fragmented rainbows across the stone floor. She found the priest kneeling in prayer at the altar, his shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. "Father," she called softly, approaching cautiously, "I need your help." Calloway rose slowly, turning to face her. His eyes widened when he saw the thread at the corner of her mouth, and he crossed himself instinctively. "Dear God," he murmured, "it's begun." "What do you mean it's begun?" Ellie snapped, her patience wearing thin. "You know more than you're letting on. Tell me what's happening to me." The priest sighed heavily, motioning for her to sit in one of the pews. Reluctantly, she obeyed, clutching the journal tightly in her lap. "When the witch trials ended," Calloway began, his voice trembling with guilt, "we thought we'd silence them forever. We gagged them, burned them, buried them in unmarked graves. But we were wrong. Their spirits never left. They became part of the fog, feeding on our fear, our shame. Over time, the fog grew stronger, claiming not just those accused of witchcraft, but anyone harboring sin." "And the singing?" Ellie prompted, her voice tight. "Their voices are stolen," Calloway explained, "used to amplify the fog's power. Each confession adds to the choir, strengthening the entity controlling it. Once you hear the hymns, it's too late. You're already one of them." Ellie's heart sank. "Is there any way to stop it? To undo what's been done?" The priest hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "There is a ritual, a way to banish the fog, but it requires blood. Innocent blood." Ellie recoiled, horrified. "You can't seriously expect me to kill someone." "No," Calloway said quickly, raising his hands defensively. "Not murder, sacrifice. Someone must willingly give themselves to the fog, confessing all their sins and accepting judgment. Only then will the entity release its hold." Ellie stared at him, incredulous. "And who would volunteer for that? Who would willingly walk into that nightmare?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Calloway met her gaze, his expression grim. "Perhaps no one should have to. Perhaps it's my penance to bear." Before Ellie could respond, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They echoed through the church, reverberating off the stone walls like a chorus of ghosts. Both Ellie and Calloway froze, listening as the voices coalesced into a single, chilling phrase: "Confess." That night, Ellie returned to the lighthouse, determined to confront whatever awaited her. Armed with a journal, a flashlight, and a growing sense of dread, she climbed the rocky path leading to the crumbling structure. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers swelled into a deafening roar as she approached the iron door. Inside, the symbols carved into the walls glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the beating of her heart. She set the journal down on the altar-like table, flipping through its pages until she found the ritual described in cryptic detail. Blood offerings, chants in dead languages, a final act of surrender. As she read, the shadows around her began to shift, separating from the walls and coalescing into human-like forms. Their glowing white eyes locked onto her, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Ellie's hands trembled as she reached for the black thread at the corner of her mouth. Pulling it sent waves of agony through her skull, but she gritted her teeth and tore it free, gasping as blood trickled down her chin. The figures advanced, closing in around her, their movements silent but deliberate. "You want my confession?" she spat, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Fine, take it. But I'm not going down without a fight." With that, she began reciting the ritual aloud, her voice rising above the cacophony of whispers. The room vibrated. Then the ground beneath her feet cracked open, revealing an abyss of swirling gray mist. From within, a voice emerged. Not a whisper, but a scream so loud it shattered the glass in the lighthouse windows. "You cannot escape us," it hissed. "We are your guilt, your shame, your truth. Ellie staggered backward, clutching the journal to her chest. "Maybe not," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But neither can you escape me." And with that, she hurled the journal into the abyss, shouting the final incantation. The world dissolved into chaos. The world came back to Ellie in fragments, sharp, jagged pieces of memory that refused to fit together. She woke sprawled on the cold stone floor of the lighthouse, her body trembling and drenched in sweat. The journal lay beside her, its pages scorched black, as if consumed by fire. Her flashlight had rolled across the room, its beam flickering weakly against the far wall. For a moment, she thought it was over. The fog had retreated, the voices silenced, the figures vanished. But then she noticed the thread. It wasn't just one strand anymore. It was dozens, snaking out from her mouth like roots, twisting and writhing across the floor. They glowed faintly, pulsing with an unnatural light that made her stomach churn. Each movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her jaw, as if her skin were being stretched too thin. "No," she whispered, reaching up to claw at them. But the threads resisted, snapping back into place whenever she tried to pull them free. It was as if they were alive, feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every panicked breath. Ellie stumbled outside, gasping for air. The night was eerily quiet, the stars obscured by thick clouds rolling in from the sea. The ocean below churned violently, its waves crashing against the cliffs with a fury she'd never seen before. As she watched, horrified, tendrils of gray mist began creeping up the rocky path toward her. She backed away, clutching her chest as the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. Words formed in the chaos, accusatory and cruel. "You think you can stop us? Your sins are bound to you. You belong to us now." Panic surged through her veins as she realized the ritual hadn't banished the fog. It had angered it. Whatever entity controlled the mist saw her defiance as a challenge, and it wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Ellie turned and ran, ignoring the searing pain in her legs as she scrambled down the treacherous path leading away from the lighthouse. Behind her, the mist coalesced into shadowy forms, their glowing eyes fixed on her like predators stalking prey. She could hear them now, not just whispers, but footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing off the rocks. By the time she reached the safety of her car, tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. She fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before finally managing to unlock the door. Slamming it shut behind her, she locked it and leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel. Her reflection stared back at her in the rearview mirror, pale and wide-eyed. But something was wrong. Her lips weren't stitched shut anymore. Instead, they moved silently, mimicking words she couldn't hear. And when she blinked, her reflection didn't. It smiled, desperate for answers, and terrified of what she might see if she looked in the mirror again. Ellie drove straight to Dr. Samuel Graves' clinic. The building loomed ahead of her, its windows dark, save for a single light glowing faintly in the upstairs office. She pounded on the door until the doctor appeared, bleary-eyed and disheveled, his lab coat wrinkled and stained. "What is it?" he demanded, squinting against the harsh glare of her headlights. "They're inside me," Ellie blurted, pointing frantically at her mouth. "The threads, they won't stop growing. I don't know how to make them go away." Graves ushered her inside, locking the door behind them. His expression was grim as he led her to an examination room, motioning for her to sit on the table. He grabbed a scalpel and a pair of tweezers, hesitating briefly before leaning in close. "This may hurt," he warned, gripping one of the threads. Ellie braced herself, clenching her fists as he tugged gently. The pain was excruciating, a sharp, burning sensation that radiated through her entire skull. But the thread didn't budge. Instead, it seemed to dig deeper, burrowing further into her flesh. "It's no use," Graves muttered, stepping back. "Whatever this is, it's not physical, not entirely." "What do you mean?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking. "I've been studying the victims," he admitted reluctantly. "Those who return after being taken, their bodies show signs of cellular mutation. Their vocal cords are fused shut, replaced by these filaments, like organic wiring. But it's not just biological, it's metaphysical. The fog alters them on a fundamental level." Ellie stared at him, horror dawning in her eyes. So, I'm becoming one of them. Graves nodded slowly, his face pale. I'm afraid so, unless we find a way to reverse it. And how exactly do you plan to do that? She snapped, anger cutting through her fear. He hesitated, glancing toward the locked door as if expecting someone or something to burst through at any moment. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. There's another option, a failsafe of sorts. If we can isolate the source of the fog, the core entity controlling it, we might be able to destroy it. But it won't be easy, and it won't be safe. Ellie swallowed hard, her mind racing. Where do we start? The graveyard, Graves replied grimly. St. Agnes Church. That's where it all began. The next morning, Ellie and Graves stood at the edge of St. Agnes Cemetery, the headstones jutting out of the ground like broken teeth. The air was unnaturally still, the silence oppressive. Even the birds had fled, leaving the landscape eerily devoid of life. This is where they buried the witches, Graves explained, scanning the rows of weathered markers. Their spirits became trapped between worlds, feeding on the guilt of those who wronged them. Over time, they merged into a single consciousness, the silent choir. Ellie shivered, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. So, we're dealing with ghosts? Spirits? Not exactly, Graves corrected. More like echoes, fragments of humanity twisted into something else, something hungry. As they ventured deeper into the cemetery, the ground beneath their feet grew softer, sinking slightly with each step. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder as they approached a crumbling mausoleum at the center of the graveyard. Its doors hung open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. Ellie hesitated, peering into the abyss. You're sure about this? Graves shook his head, his expression grim. No, but we don't have a choice. They descended carefully, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the stench of earth and decay. At the bottom, they found themselves in a cavernous chamber filled with rotting coffins and shattered urns. In the center of the room stood an altar-like structure, its surface carved with symbols identical to those in the lighthouse, and surrounding it were the bodies. Dozens of them, arranged in concentric circles like offerings. Some were skeletal, their remains centuries old. Others were disturbingly fresh, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. Black threads connected them to the altar, weaving intricate patterns across the floor. Oh God, Ellie whispered, covering her mouth to stifle a sob. Among the bodies, she recognized Tommy Walsh, the fisherman whose boat had washed ashore days earlier. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his lips were sewn shut with black thread. Before she could react, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. Shadows peeled away from the walls, coalescing into humanoid forms that advanced toward them with unnatural speed. Ellie stumbled backward, tripping over one of the corpses as the figures closed in. Now, Graves shouted, pulling a vial of liquid from his pocket. He hurled it at the altar, shattering it against the stone surface. Flames erupted instantly, consuming the threads and sending the figures reeling. But the relief was short-lived. From the flames rose a new figure, taller, darker. Ellie screamed as the creature lunged, dragging her into the inferno. Ellie awoke to the smell of charred wood and scorched flesh. Her body felt heavy as though the weight of the earth itself pressed down on her chest. Blinking against the haze filling her vision, she realized she was lying on the cold stone floor of the mausoleum's lower chamber. The flames had died down, leaving behind a thick layer of ash that clung to every surface like snowfall in hell. Dr. Graves knelt beside her, his face streaked with soot and sweat. His hands trembled as he helped her sit up, his voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone urgent but tinged with disbelief. "Can you move?" Ellie nodded weakly, though her entire body screamed in protest. She glanced around the chamber, taking stock of the devastation. The altar was reduced to rubble, its once glowing symbols now blackened and inert. The bodies arranged around it were gone, or rather, they'd been consumed by the fire. Only Tommy Walsh remained, his corpse half buried beneath the debris. His stitched lips seemed to gape wider now, as if mocking her failure. "What happened?" Ellie croaked, her throat raw from smoke and terror. Graves hesitated, glancing nervously toward the staircase leading back to the surface. "The entity, it wasn't destroyed, just weakened, and whatever part of it still exists is furious." Before Ellie could respond, a sharp sound cut through the silence. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. It came from the shadows at the edge of the chamber, where the flickering light of their flashlights failed to reach. Both Ellie and Graves froze, their eyes straining to pierce the darkness. And then Maggie stepped into view. Her red hair was matted with dirt, her freckled cheeks smudged with ash. But it was her eyes that caught Ellie's attention. They glowed faintly, the same eerie white hue as the figures in the fog. She held something in her hand, a shard of broken mirror, its jagged edge glinting menacingly in the dim light. "I warned you," Maggie said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. "I told you not to dig too deep, not to ask too many questions." Ellie staggered to her feet, clutching Graves' arm for support. "Maggie, what are you doing here? Why are your eyes like theirs?" Maggie finished, tilting her head slightly. A smile spread across her face, slow and unnatural. "Because I've always been one of them. Ever since my brother disappeared, I've been feeding the choir, keeping it strong." "No." Ellie's mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations, warnings, and cryptic notes. The journal, the lighthouse, the graveyard, it all led back to this moment. To her. "You used me," she spat, anger cutting through her fear. "You let me think you were on my side." Maggie shrugged, twirling the shard of mirror between her fingers. "Sometimes sacrifices have to be made, even by those who care about you." Behind her, the shadows stirred, coalescing into familiar forms. The silent choir emerged from the darkness, their glowing eyes fixed on Ellie like predators closing in on prey. Ellie turned to Graves, desperation clawing at her chest. "We have to get out of here, now!" But Graves didn't move. Instead, he pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping it open to reveal pages filled with hastily scrawled notes and diagrams. "There's one last thing we can try," he said grimly. "A counter-ritual. If we can force the entity to reveal its true form, we might be able to banish it for good." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Ellie demanded, her voice rising with panic. "We use your thread," Graves replied, pointing to the black filaments still snaking out from her mouth. "It's a direct link to the choir. If we sever it while reciting the incantation, it might disrupt their connection to this plane." Ellie stared at him, incredulous. "Sever it? With what? A pair of scissors?" Maggie laughed bitterly, raising the shard of mirror. "I'll do it, for old time's sake." Before Ellie could react, Maggie lunged, pressing the jagged edge against her throat. The pain was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the agony that followed when Maggie yanked the threads free. They came loose with a wet, tearing sound, sending waves of nausea crashing over Ellie as blood streamed down her chin. The choir roared in unison, their voices merging into a single deafening scream. The ground shook violently, chunks of stone crumbling from the ceiling as the entity took shape above them, a towering figure cloaked in mist, its faceless head tilted downward, its glowing eyes boring into Ellie's soul. "This is your chance," Graves shouted, shoving the notebook into her hands. "Say the words." Ellie stumbled backward, clutching the notebook as the creature advanced. Its presence was suffocating, crushing her resolve with every step. But she forced herself to focus, reading the incantation aloud despite the bile rising in her throat. "By blood and bone, by guilt and shame, I cast thee out. Return to the void from whence you came." The words reverberated through the chamber, echoing off the walls like thunder. The creature recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as if caught between worlds. For a moment, Ellie thought it might work, that the ritual would finally end the nightmare. "No," Maggie snarled, tearing the pages apart. "You don't get to undo what's been done." The creature surged forward, engulfing Maggie in a swirl of mist. Her screams echoed through the chamber as the threads reattached themselves to her, stitching her lips shut and binding her to the choir. When the mist cleared, she was gone, replaced by another shadowy figure, her glowing eyes indistinguishable from the rest. Ellie collapsed to her knees, sobbing as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The threads began growing again, sprouting from her mouth like weeds, twisting and writhing across the floor. Graves knelt beside her, his expression grim. "It's not over," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, remember this. The fog feeds on guilt. It thrives on secrets. If you want to survive, you'll have to face the truth about yourself, about why you're really here." Ellie looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "What truth?" He didn't answer. Instead, he rose to his feet, backing away slowly before turning and running up the stairs, leaving her alone with the choir. As the figures closed in, their glowing eyes locking onto hers, Ellie realized the horrifying truth. The fog hadn't chosen her at random. It had known her all along, and now it was time for her to sing. The threads grew longer, thicker, twisting across the floor like serpents seeking prey. Ellie's breaths came in shallow gasps as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the mausoleum, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The silent choir surrounded her now, their glowing eyes unblinking, their forms flickering between shadow and substance. She could feel their hunger, a palpable, suffocating force that seemed to pull at her very soul. Her mind raced, replaying fragments of the ritual, Maggie's betrayal, and Graves's cryptic warning. What truth had he been referring to? What secret was buried so deeply within her that even she couldn't face it? And then it hit her, a memory long suppressed, buried beneath years of denial and self-justification, a decision made in desperation, one that had haunted her dreams for years, but never fully taken shape in her waking hours. It wasn't just guilt, it was complicity. "Stop!" Ellie shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. "I'll confess! Just let me speak!" The choir halted, tilting their heads in unison as if considering her plea. The whispers faded into silence, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing echoing through the chamber. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet their glowing eyes. "It was my fault," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother. She didn't deserve what happened." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, raw and jagged like shards of glass. She was dying, cancer, terminal, and I couldn't handle it. I couldn't watch her waste away, day after day, begging me to stay when all I wanted was to run. So I left. I told myself it was temporary. I'd come back when I was ready, when I could be strong for her, but I never did. Tears streamed down her face as the memories flooded back. Late-night phone calls she ignored, letters she threw away unopened, voicemails she deleted without listening. Her mother's voice, fragile and pleading, fading into static. She died alone, Ellie choked out, clutching her chest as if trying to hold herself together. And I didn't even go to the funeral. I couldn't face it, couldn't face her. The chamber quaked violently, the ground splitting open as the entity loomed closer, its form shifting and writhing like smoke caught in a storm. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if it were feeding on her confession, siphoning her guilt to fuel its power. But something else happened too. The threads binding her mouth began to loosen, unraveling slightly as her voice cracked under the strain of her admission. The choir's glow dimmed ever so faintly, their movements slowing as if weakened by her word. Encouraged, Ellie pushed forward, forcing herself to confront the darkest corners of her guilt. I told myself it was because I was protecting her, that seeing me would remind her of death. But it wasn't about her. It was about me. I was selfish, weak. And now she's gone, and I can't take it back. Her voice broke on the last word, dissolving into sobs as the chamber fell silent once more. The entity hovered above her, its glowing eyes narrowing as if studying her closely. For a fleeting moment, Ellie thought it might release her, might banish itself back to the void now that it had consumed her truth. But then it spoke, its voice reverberating through the chamber like a chorus of screams. Your sins are bound to you. You cannot escape. Before Ellie could react, footsteps echoed from the staircase leading up to the surface. Dr. Samuel Graves appeared at the top, his lab coat torn and bloodied, his face pale but resolute. In his hands, he clutched a vial filled with a shimmering silver liquid. I should have done this sooner, he said, descending cautiously into the chamber. His gaze darted between Ellie and the choir, his expression grim but determined. This ends now. Graves? Ellie rasped, struggling to her feet. What is that? The fail-safe, he replied, holding up the vial. Liquid mercury infused with salt water and ash. It disrupts their connection to this plane. If we can get it into the core. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he lunged toward the altar, hurling the vial directly at the entity. The liquid exploded on impact, sending shockwaves rippling through the chamber. The choir screamed in unison, their forms dissolving into mist as the ground beneath them cracked and splintered. Ellie stumbled backward, shielding her face as chunks of stone rained down from the ceiling. When the dust settled, the entity was gone, or at least diminished. The threads binding her loosened further, retreating partially into her mouth as the fog began to recede. But Graves wasn't finished. He turned to Ellie, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. There's one last thing I need you to do. What? She asked, her voice shaking. Take this, he said, pressing a small dagger into her hand. Its blade gleamed faintly, etched with symbols identical to those carved into the walls of the lighthouse and the graveyard. When the time comes, use it. On yourself. Ellie recoiled, staring at him in horror. What are you talking about? The fog feeds on guilt, Graves explained, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. But it also craves innocence. To truly banish it, someone pure must offer themselves willingly, someone who hasn't yet succumbed to its influence. You mean me? Ellie whispered, realization dawning in her eyes. Graves nodded grimly. You've confessed your sins. Before she could respond, the ground shook violently, knocking them both off their feet. From the shadows emerged the remnants of the choir, their forms flickering but still menacing. They advanced slowly, their glowing eyes fixed on Graves. No! Ellie shouted, scrambling to her feet. Leave him alone! But it was too late. The figures swarmed him, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the chamber as the fog enveloped him completely, silencing him forever. Alone once more, Ellie collapsed to her knees, clutching the dagger tightly in her fist. The whispers returned, softer now, but no less insistent. Confess. Surrender. Sing. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she realized what she had to do. The fog wouldn't stop, not until it claimed its final victim. And if it meant saving Blackwater Cove, if it meant ending the cycle of guilt and shame that had plagued the town for centuries, then so be it. With trembling hands, she raised the dagger to her chest, positioning the tip over her heart. The choir watched silently, their glowing eyes fixed on her as she prepared to deliver the fatal blow. But just as she tightened her grip on the hilt, a voice cut through the silence. Not a whisper, but a scream. "Stop!" Ellie froze, her eyes snapping open. Standing at the edge of the chamber was Maggie, or rather, what remained of her. Her body was gaunt, her skin translucent, her lips stitched shut with black thread. But her eyes, her human eyes, were wide with desperation. "You don't have to do this," Maggie pleaded, her voice muffled but clear. "There's another way." Ellie hesitated, lowering the dagger slightly. "What are you talking about? How can there be another way?" Maggie stepped closer, reaching out a trembling hand. "The fog, it doesn't just feed on guilt, it feeds on fear. If you can face it, if you can stand against it without giving in, then maybe, just maybe, you can break its hold." Ellie stared at her, uncertainty warring with hope. Could it really be that simple? Or was this just another trick, another test designed to lure her deeper into the fog's grasp? Only one way to find out. The air in the mausoleum was thick with tension, each breath Ellie took feeling like a gulp of smoke and ash. Maggie stood before her, gaunt and ghostly, her stitched lips trembling as if fighting to form words. Her glowing eyes flickered faintly, remnants of the choir's influence still clinging to her like cobwebs. But there was something else in her gaze, something human, fragile and desperate.
"You don't have to do this,"
Maggie repeated, her voice muffled but insistent.
"You can fight it. You're stronger than they are."
Ellie tightened her grip on the dagger, her knuckles white. "Stronger? Look at me, Maggie. I'm tied to them. These threads, they're inside me. They've been feeding on me since the moment I got here. How am I supposed to fight something that's already part of me?" Maggie stepped closer, ignoring the way the shadows around them shifted uneasily at her approach.
"Because you're not just guilt or fear. You're more than what they've made you believe. If you give in now, you'll become one of them, one of us. And is that really what you want?"
Ellie hesitated, lowering the dagger slightly. She glanced at the silent choir, their forms flickering like dying embers. They watched silently, their glowing eyes unblinking, waiting for her decision. For a moment, she wondered if they were afraid, if her defiance had shaken their confidence. Or maybe they were just biding their time, knowing full well she didn't stand a chance. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, Ellie rose to her feet. The dagger felt heavy in her hand, its weight both a comfort and a burden. She turned to face the choir, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I won't confess anymore," she declared, her words ringing out through the chamber. "I won't sing. I won't surrender. You've taken enough from me, from all of us. It ends now." The choir reacted instantly, surging forward in unison. Their glowing eyes flared brighter, their movements faster and more erratic. The whispers returned louder and angrier than ever, coalescing into a single, deafening roar.
"You cannot resist us! Your sins belong to us! Join us!"
Ellie staggered backward, clutching the dagger tightly. The threads binding her mouth tightened painfully, digging into her flesh as if trying to pull her toward the choir. She fought against them, gritting her teeth as fresh blood trickled down her chin.
"You hear that?"
Ellie shouted, her voice cracking under the strain.
"That's fear! That's guilt! That's everything you thrive on! But it's not enough anymore!"
With a cry of defiance, she plunged the dagger into the ground, driving it deep into the cracked stone beneath her feet. The chamber quaked violently. chunks of the ceiling crumbling as a shockwave rippled outward. The choir recoiled, their forms dissolving momentarily into mist before reforming, weaker and less cohesive. Maggie stumbled forward, grabbing Ellie's arm. "Keep going. Don't stop." Ellie nodded, tears streaming down her face as she forced herself to stand tall. She raised her voice, shouting the incantation Graves had given her earlier, imbuing each word with every ounce of strength she had left. "By blood and bone, by guilt and shame, I cast thee out. Return to the void from whence you came." The words echoed through the chamber, reverberating off the walls like thunder. The choir screamed in unison, their voices merging into a cacophony of pain and fury. The threads binding Ellie began to unravel completely, snapping free of her mouth and dissolving into ash. The fog swirled chaotically, retreating from the edges of the room as if burned by sunlight. But the entity wasn't done yet. From the swirling mist emerged a towering figure, larger and more monstrous than any of the others. Its faceless head tilted downward, its glowing eyes locking onto Ellie with predatory intensity. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a deafening screech that shook the very foundation of the mausoleum. Ellie froze, paralyzed by terror as the creature advanced. Maggie pushed her aside, stepping between her and the entity. "No!" Maggie screamed, raising her arms protectively. "Take me instead." The creature paused, tilting its head curiously. Then, without warning, it lunged, engulfing Maggie in a swirl of mist. Her screams echoed through the chamber as the threads reattached themselves to her, stitching her lips shut once more. When the fog cleared, she was gone, replaced by another shadowy figure, indistinguishable from the rest. Ellie collapsed to her knees, sobbing as the reality of Maggie's sacrifice sank in. She had given herself willingly, buying Ellie precious seconds to act, but it wasn't enough. The entity loomed closer, its presence suffocating, its intent clear. Unless Ellie did something drastic, it would consume her too. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, Ellie grabbed the dagger from the ground and held it aloft, pointing it directly at the creature. Her voice was hoarse, but resolute as she spoke. "If you want me, you'll have to take me whole. No guilt, no fear, just me." The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing. When Ellie opened her eyes, the creature was gone. The fog had lifted entirely, leaving behind only the cold, sterile air of the underground chamber. The threads binding her were nothing more than ash scattered across the floor, carried away by an unseen breeze. Even the symbols carved into the walls had faded, their glow extinguished forever. She stumbled to her feet, clutching the dagger tightly in her hand. Maggie's body lay motionless nearby, her stitched lips parted slightly as if frozen mid-scream. Ellie knelt beside her, brushing a strand of red hair from her face. "I'm sorry," Ellie whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." For a long moment, she sat there, staring at Maggie's lifeless form. Then, with a heavy heart, she rose to her feet and climbed the stairs leading back to the surface. The graveyard was eerily quiet, the stars visible once more in the night sky. The oppressive weight that had hung over Blackwater Cove for centuries seemed to have lifted, replaced by an almost unnatural calm. As Ellie stepped out of the mausoleum, she realized something strange. Her reflection no longer smiled back at her. The morning sun rose over Blackwater Cove, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets and weathered cottages. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the town was bathed in golden light rather than the oppressive gray of the fog. Birds chirped tentatively in the trees, their songs hesitant but hopeful, as if testing whether the silence had truly ended. But for Ellie Hart, there was no peace to be found. She stood at the edge of St. Agnes Cemetery, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the crumbling mausoleum that had nearly claimed her life. The dagger still hung heavy in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the choices she'd made, and those she hadn't. Maggie was gone. Dr. Graves was gone. Father Calloway, Tommy Walsh, countless others whose names she didn't even know, they were all gone too. And yet, here she was, alive, breathing, whole, but at what cost? Ellie returned to the Salty Anchor, her footsteps echoing hollowly against the empty streets. The inn was eerily quiet, its usual patrons absent or unwilling to meet her gaze. Mr. Hargrove glanced up from behind the counter as she entered, his watery blue eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "You're still here," he said simply, his voice devoid of judgment. "For now," Ellie replied, forcing a weak smile. "I don't think I'll be staying much longer." Hargrove nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing less. "The fog's lifted. Folks are saying the curse is broken. But—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Curses leave scars, Miss Hart. Even when they're gone, you can still feel 'em." Ellie didn't respond. She climbed the narrow staircase to her room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The space felt alien now, stripped of the familiarity it had once held. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the dagger from her pocket and turning it over in her hands. Its blade gleamed faintly in the sunlight streaming through the window, the symbols etched into its surface, almost mocking in their permanence. Her notebook lay open on the desk, its pages filled with fragmented notes, sketches, and confessions. She flipped through them absently, stopping at one entry in particular, a hastily scrawled sentence that sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over her. "If you survive, will it mean anything?" She closed the notebook abruptly, tossing it aside as if it might burn her fingers. Her gaze drifted to the mirror hanging on the wall, and for the first time since arriving in Blackwater Cove, she allowed herself to look directly into it. Her reflection stared back, pale and hollow-eyed, but undeniably hers. No glowing eyes, no stitched lips, no phantom smiles lurking beneath the surface. Just Ellie. In the reflection, standing just behind her shoulder, was Maggie. Ellie spun around, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. The room was empty, save for the scattered belongings on the bed and desk. She turned back to the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. Maggie's reflection remained. Her stitched lips parted slightly as if trying to speak. Her glowing eyes locked onto Ellie's, filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Slowly, deliberately, she raised a finger to her lips, a silent command to remain quiet. And then she pointed toward the journal lying discarded on the desk. Ellie hesitated, glancing between the mirror and the notebook. Finally, she reached for it, flipping it open to a blank page. As she did, words began appearing on the paper as if written by an invisible hand. "You stopped them, but they aren't gone." Ellie's hands trembled as she read the message, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean? I broke the cycle, the fog's gone." Maggie's reflection tilted its head slightly, gesturing toward Ellie's mouth. It took her a moment to realize what she meant, but when she touched her lips, she felt it. A single strand of black thread, impossibly thin, snaking out from the corner of her mouth. "No," Ellie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "No, please." The thread tightened slightly, tugging at her flesh with a sharp, electric pain. Maggie's reflection stepped closer in the mirror, reaching out a hand as if trying to comfort her. But before Ellie could react, the shimmering figure dissolved into mist, leaving her alone once more. That night, unable to sleep, Ellie wandered the deserted streets of Blackwater Cove. The town was eerily silent, its residents either celebrating their newfound freedom or mourning those who had been lost. She found herself drawn to the harbor, where the ocean stretched endlessly into the horizon, its waves lapping gently against the rocky shore. As she stood there, staring out at the water, the whispers returned. Faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the tide, but they grew louder, coalescing into a familiar melody. Join us. Sing with us. You belong to us. Ellie clenched her fists, fighting back tears as the thread tugged painfully at her mouth. She knew what it wanted: to drag her back into the fog, to claim her as one of the choir. But she also knew something else. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had merely retreated, waiting for her guard to drop so it could strike again. And it would never stop. Not until she gave in. With trembling hands, Ellie pulled the dagger from her pocket, holding it aloft in the moonlight. The symbols etched into its blade glimmered faintly, as if— "I won't sing," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Not for you. Not ever." The whispers faltered, fading into silence as the thread loosened slightly, retreating into her mouth. Ellie sank to her knees, clutching the dagger tightly as the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. The fog wasn't gone. It couldn't be banished, not completely. It lived within her now, a part of her as surely as her guilt and her shame. And while she might have survived this battle, the war was far from over. The dagger felt heavier than ever in Ellie's hand as she sat alone on the rocky shore, the ocean's rhythmic waves providing a strange comfort amidst the chaos swirling inside her. The thread still lingered in her mouth, tugging at her flesh like an insistent whisper. It wasn't painful anymore. Not exactly, but it was constant, a reminder that the fog hadn't truly left her. She could feel its presence lurking just beneath the surface of her skin, waiting for her resolve to crack. She glanced down at the blade, its symbols glinting faintly in the moonlight. If she wanted to end this, if she wanted to sever whatever tie bound her to the silent choir, she knew what she had to do. But the thought of cutting into herself again, of tearing apart the fragile barrier between her humanity and the entity within her, filled her with a paralyzing dread. And yet there was no other choice. Ellie rose to her feet, clutching the dagger tightly as she made her way back toward the lighthouse. The structure loomed ahead of her, its broken windows and crumbling walls casting jagged shadows across the ground. Inside, the air was colder than before, carrying the faint scent of salt water and decay. The symbols carved into the walls seemed darker now, almost alive, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the beating of her heart. She set the dagger down on the altar-like table, flipping open the charred remains of the journal she'd retrieved from the mausoleum. Most of its pages were illegible, reduced to ash during the final confrontation with the choir. But one passage remained intact, a hastily scrawled incantation written in Dr. Graves's shaky handwriting. To sever the bond, spill your blood willingly, speak the truth, face the void, and accept the consequences. Ellie swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the cool night air. Accept the consequences, she muttered bitterly, tracing the words with her finger. What did that even mean? Would severing the thread destroy the entity, or would it unleash something worse? Before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed the dagger and pressed the tip against her palm once more. This time, she didn't stop at the thin line of blood. With a sharp intake of breath, she dragged the blade across her skin, carving a shallow but deliberate wound. Blood welled up instantly, dripping onto the stone floor in scarlet droplets. As the first drop hit the ground, the chamber quaked violently, sending chunks of debris tumbling from the ceiling. Shadows peeled away from the walls, coalescing into humanoid forms that advanced toward her with unnatural speed. Their glowing eyes locked onto hers, their movements silent but deliberate. "You cannot escape us," they hissed in unison, their voices reverberating through the room like a chorus of screams. Ellie staggered backward, clutching her bleeding hand as the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The thread tightened painfully, digging into her flesh as if trying to pull her toward the figures. She fought against it, gritting her teeth as fresh blood trickled down her chin. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, her voice cracking under the strain. "You don't own me." The figures recoiled slightly, their forms flickering as if weakened by her defiance. Encouraged, Ellie stepped forward, raising her voice as she recited the incantation aloud. "By blood and bone, by guilt and shame, I cast thee out. Return to the void from whence you came." The words echoed through the chamber, reverberating off the walls like thunder. The figures screamed in unison, their voices merging into a cacophony of pain and fury. The thread binding her loosened completely, snapping free of her mouth and dissolving into ash. The fog swirled chaotically, retreating from the edges of the room as if burned by sunlight. But the entity wasn't done yet. From the swirling mist emerged a towering figure, larger and more monstrous than any of the others. Its faceless head tilted downward, its glowing eyes locking onto Ellie with predatory intensity. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a deafening screech that shook the very foundation of the lighthouse. Ellie froze, paralyzed by terror as the creature advanced. She raised the dagger defensively, knowing full well it wouldn't be enough. The entity loomed closer, its massive form blotting out the light as it prepared to strike. Just as it lunged, a voice cut through the chaos, a soft, muffled cry that sent a shiver down Ellie's spine. Not her. Maggie stepped out of the shadows, her stitched lips trembling as if fighting to form words. Her body was translucent now, barely more than a ghost, but her glowing eyes burned with determination. She stood between Ellie and the entity, spreading her arms protectively. "Take me instead," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fog. "She's already paid her price." The entity hesitated, tilting its head curiously. Then, without warning, it surged forward, engulfing Maggie in a swirl of mist. Her screams echoed through the chamber as the threads reattached themselves to her, stitching her lips shut once more. When the fog cleared, she was gone, replaced by another shadowy figure, indistinguishable from the rest. Ellie collapsed to her knees, sobbing as the reality of Maggie's sacrifice sank in. She had given herself willingly, buying Ellie precious seconds to act, but it wasn't enough. The entity loomed closer, its presence suffocating, its intent clear. Unless Ellie did something drastic, it would consume her too. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, Ellie grabbed the dagger from the ground and held it aloft, pointing it directly at the creature. Her voice was hoarse but resolute as she spoke. "If you want me, you'll have to take me whole. No guilt, no fear, just me." The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as if studying her closely. For a moment, Ellie thought it might retreat, might dissolve back into the void without a fight, but then it surged forward, its massive form blotting out the light as it prepared to strike. Ellie closed her eyes, bracing herself for impact. And then, silence. The silence that followed was deafening. Ellie opened her eyes cautiously, half expecting the towering figure of the silent choir to still be looming over her, its glowing eyes burning into her soul. But the chamber was empty, save for the faint remnants of mist dissolving into nothingness. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air since her arrival in Blackwater Cove was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that felt almost unnatural. Ellie lowered the dagger, her hand trembling as she stared at the spot where the entity had stood moments before. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths, her body weak from exhaustion and blood loss. The wound on her palm throbbed painfully, a stark reminder of the ritual she'd just performed and the price Maggie had paid to save her. But as Ellie rose unsteadily to her feet, clutching the dagger tightly, she realized something strange. The thread was gone. completely. Not just loosened or dissolved, but absent altogether. She touched her lips gingerly, expecting to feel the phantom tug of stitches or the cold bite of guilt. But there was nothing. Nothing except the lingering ache in her heart. Dawn broke over Blackwater Cove as Ellie stumbled out of the lighthouse, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. The sun painted the horizon in streaks of gold and pink, casting long shadows across the rocky cliffs. For the first time in weeks, the town felt alive again. Birds chirped tentatively in the trees, their songs hesitant but hopeful, while distant waves crashed rhythmically against the shore. Yet, despite the beauty surrounding her, Ellie couldn't shake the emptiness gnawing at her core. The fog was gone, yes. The silent choir had retreated, or perhaps even been banished entirely. But the scars it left behind were far deeper than any physical wound. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the memories of those who hadn't survived. Maggie's face haunted her thoughts most of all. The red-haired fisherman who had warned her, trusted her, betrayed her, and ultimately sacrificed herself to ensure Ellie's survival. What right did she have to live when so many others had died? What made her worthy of redemption? She wandered aimlessly through the streets of the town, avoiding the curious stares of residents who had begun emerging from their homes. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices tinged with relief but also unease. Some nodded politely as she passed, others crossed themselves instinctively, as if fearing she carried traces of the fog within her still. Ellie wanted to tell them everything, the truth about the choir, the rituals, the sacrifices. But how could she explain something so incomprehensible? How could she put into words the horrors she'd faced without sounding like a madwoman? Instead, she retreated to the salty anchor, collapsing onto the edge of her bed and staring blankly at the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection stared back, pale and hollow-eyed, but undeniably hers. No glowing eyes, no stitched lips, no phantom smiles lurking beneath the surface. Just Ellie, broken, battered, and alive. But as she studied her face, something caught her eye. A faint shimmer along the edges of the glass, like heat rising from asphalt. She leaned closer, squinting, and froze. And the reflection standing just behind her shoulder was Maggie. The silence that followed was deafening. Ellie opened her eyes cautiously, half expecting the towering figure of the silent choir to still be looming over her, its glowing eyes burning into her soul. But the chamber was empty, save for the faint remnants of mist dissolving into nothingness. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air since her arrival in Blackwater Cove was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that felt almost unnatural. Ellie lowered the dagger, her hand trembling as she stared at the spot where the entity had stood moments before. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths, her body weak from exhaustion and blood loss. The wound on her palm throbbed painfully, a stark reminder of the ritual she'd just performed and the price Maggie had paid to save her. But as Ellie rose unsteadily to her feet, clutching the dagger tightly, she realized something strange. The thread was gone, completely. Not just loosened or dissolved, but absent altogether. She touched her lips gingerly, expecting to feel the phantom tug of stitches or the cold bite of guilt. But there was nothing. Nothing except the lingering ache in her heart. Dawn broke over Blackwater Cove as Ellie stumbled out of the lighthouse, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. The sun painted the horizon in streaks of gold and pink, casting long shadows across the rocky cliffs. For the first time in weeks, the town felt alive again. Birds chirped tentatively in the trees, their songs hesitant but hopeful, while distant waves crashed rhythmically against the shore. Yet, despite the beauty surrounding her, Ellie couldn't shake the emptiness gnawing at her core. The fog was gone, yes. The silent choir had retreated, or perhaps even been banished entirely, but the scars it left behind were far deeper than any physical wound. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the memories of those who hadn't survived. Maggie's face haunted her thoughts most of all. The red-haired fisherman who had warned her, trusted her, betrayed her, and ultimately sacrificed herself to ensure Ellie's survival. What right did she have to live when so many others had died? What made her worthy of redemption? She wandered aimlessly through the streets of the town, avoiding the curious stares of residents who had begun emerging from their homes. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices tinged with relief but also unease. Some nodded politely as she passed. Others crossed themselves instinctively, as if fearing she carried traces of the fog within her still. Ellie wanted to tell them everything, the truth about the choir, the rituals, the sacrifices, but how could she explain something so incomprehensible? How could she put into words the horrors she'd faced without sounding like a mad woman? Instead, she retreated to the salty anchor, collapsing onto the edge of her bed and staring blankly at the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection stared back, pale and hollow-eyed, but undeniably hers. No glowing eyes, no stitched lips, no phantom smiles lurking beneath the surface. Just Ellie, broken, battered, and alive. But as she studied her face, something caught her eye. A faint shimmer along the edges of the glass, like heat rising from asphalt. She leaned closer, squinting, and froze. In the reflection, standing just behind her shoulder, was Maggie. Ellie spun around, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. The room was empty, save for the scattered belongings on the bed and desk. She turned back to the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. Maggie's reflection remained, her stitched lips parted slightly as if trying to speak. Her glowing eyes locked onto Ellie's, filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Slowly, deliberately, she raised a finger to her lips, a silent command to remain quiet. And then she pointed toward the journal lying discarded on the desk. Ellie hesitated, glancing between the mirror and the notebook. Finally, she reached for it, flipping it open to a blank page. As she did, words began appearing on the paper as if written by an invisible hand. "You stopped them, but they aren't gone." Ellie.
Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in your nightmares.